Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics. And what we do is all for free, and for our love of Jesus Christ, and for our Holy Mother, the Church, and we'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. We are back with Douglas MacArthur, and finally getting into the Korean War. So, where we leave off is after June 19th, and Dulles is going to the 38th parallel, saying, "Oh, everything's fine, everything is dandy back to the United States and to the Congress." It was on early morning, Sunday, June 25th, 1950, when the telephone rang in my bedroom at the American Embassy in Tokyo. It rang with a note of urgency that can sound only in the hush of a darkened room. It was the duty officer at headquarters. "General," he said, "we have just received a dispatch from Seoul advising that the North Koreans have struck in great strength in south across the 30th parallel at 4 o'clock this morning." So, welcome, Brother Alexis.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV to discuss this important final active phase in the life of General Douglas MacArthur, one of the great American generals. And before I begin, I want to thank once again the Douglas A. MacArthur National Library in Norfolk, Virginia, where he's buried, if you'd like to visit his tomb, for letting us read from this wonderful book called Reminiscences. And maybe, AJ, if you have it at hand, you can show it to everyone. You can get from the Navy bookstore. And this is a great mind, a great military strategist, tactician, logician, a great statesman, politician, who, if he had been president of the United States, he would have changed the course of history, and we wouldn't be in these dark days we are now. Him and Patton. And we talked on our last program how he started to realize that there was something really wrong and deeply wrong in the United States. But in this war in Korea, he's going to run into the practical aspects of it, of how what was wrong in the United States actually caused this war and caused the lives of thousands of men in this war, totally unnecessarily. So if you don't know your geography, Korea is that peninsula that sticks out between China and Japan. And in the Second World War, it was occupied by the Empire of Japan. And when it was liberated by the Allies, the Russians and Chinese liberated the northern half, and the Americans and the British liberated the southern half. And so it became divided at the 38th parallel between, it was one government, but divided into two sections, and eventually became two governments. We call them North Korea and South Korea today. Call that back then. This was a surprise attack, and this is the first time the Marxist bloc attacks the West, because Patton had said we shouldn't let Russia stand, we should go right to Moscow. They got rid of Patton, Eisenhower, and his friends. It's pretty clear they had a very heavy hand in assassinating Patton. And here we are now, 6 years later, and Russia and China take the initiative, and they do declare the war. So the first lesson you learn: don't make peace with a Marxist, because he'll always declare war on you.
Yeah.
What did MacArthur do at this astounding news? He's still the military governor of Japan. He's ready to leave office there.
So it continues. "I had an uncanny feeling of nightmare. It had been 9 years before, on a Sunday morning, at the same hour, that a telephone call with the same note of urgency had awakened me in the penthouse atop the Manila Hotel. It was the same fell note of the war cry that was again ringing in my ear. It couldn't be, I told myself. Not again. I must still be asleep and dreaming. Not again. But then came the crisp, cool voice of my fine chief of staff, General Ned Altman. Any orders, General? How, I asked myself, could the United States have allowed such a deplorable situation to develop? I thought back to those days only a short time before when our country had been militarily more powerful than any nation on earth. General Marshall, then Army Chief of Staff, had reported to the Secretary of War in 1945. Never was the strength of American democracy so evident, nor has it ever been so clearly within our power to give definite guidance for our course into the future of the human race. But in a short space of 5 years, this power had been frittered away in a bankruptcy of positive and courageous leadership toward any long-range objectives. Again, I asked myself, what is the United States policy in Asia? And the appalling thought came, the United States has no definite policy in Asia. Dulles returned to Tokyo and wired the Secretary of State. Believe that if it appears the South Koreans cannot themselves contain or repulse the attack, United States forces should be used even though the risk Russian counter moves. To sit by while Korea is overrun by unprovoked armed attack would start a war.
So here, MacArthur's running into the reality that there's some other agenda. The people control the United States have some other agenda, and it's not American power. It's not the defense of the United States. It is something else. And we only know what that is now, many years later, but he was running into it. It would seem totally contradictory, and he hadn't yet put his finger on it, but he knew there was something seriously wrong. So it is an absolute tragedy when you have absolute military supremacy not to use it to defend your position in such wise that people aren't going to attack you. And in the background behind me is a beautiful image of Caracas Chevaliers, which is in Syria, just north of the Lebanese border. And when the Crusaders were in power, they put down fortifications that would last a century. They weren't about, we don't need to do anything. We can relax and go to the beach. No, that's not how you run an empire. And America's never done that because America's never been ruled by Americans, people who really believe America in America, and this is a fundamental thing. So, what were the first things MacArthur did to attempt to repel or at least save the existing forces in South Korea, who in a matter, I think, of 12 weeks were nearly entirely overrun and reduced to a tiny little bit of land on the southeast coast?
So within minutes, flights of transport planes were rising off runways in Japan, and ships at sea were swinging about and heading full draft towards the Korean ports. When enemy aircraft began threatening, I sent in our warplanes from Japan, and they got out women, children, and everyone. The operation was successfully concluded without the loss of a single man, woman, or child. So then he's like going over what South Korea has. The South Korean had 4 divisions along the 38th parallel. Plenty of guys, if it was well equipped. They had been well trained, the personnel were brave and patriotic, but they were equipped and organized as a constabulary force, not as troops of the line. They had only light weapons, no air or naval forces, and were lacking in tanks, artillery, and many other essentials. The decision to equip and organize them in this way had been made by the State Department. The argument advanced by the State Department for its decision was that it was a necessary measure to prevent the South Koreans from attacking North Korea. A curiously myopic reasoning that, of course, opened the way for North Korean attack. It was a vital and fatal error not to prepare South Korea to meet an attack from the north. The potential of such an attack was inherent in the fact that North Korean forces had tanks, heavy artillery, and fighter aircraft, which the South Korea was not equipped.
Now this is your classic What he's noticing is the classic architecture under which Marxists and left-wingers in the West have put all conservatives and Christians. You Christians are dangerous people. You people who are allies of the West, you could start a war. You need to be disarmed. Once you're disarmed, that will prove that you're peaceful. Whereas Marxist, communist, leftists, and dictators, they have to arm themselves because they have the right to defense. You see it on the streets of America between Antifa that's armed and people who aren't armed. And who's at fault? It's the people who aren't armed who are at fault, not Antifa that's carrying weapons, guns, rifles, and stuff like that. Or someone like Kyle Rittenhouse, who defends himself against a pedophile that wants to murder him. He's the one that's charged. So this is standard Marxism, and this is already infiltrated through the Democratic Party. And they set Korea up for this. It's totally set up, and now MacArthur has to solve the problem. And MacArthur doesn't know in this whole thing, he's being used as a puppet to justify military spending. That's what he didn't realize. Maybe realized after the war. But he did a really good job, and he showed that this war could easily be won if there was a will in Washington to win it. So he evacuates everyone. It was a wonderful evacuation. He saved everything. The problem with the evacuation was it led to the demoralization of the Koreans. They're like, "You're abandoning us?" And he immediately assessed that no, we have to make a stand in Korea. Did he say something about that?
Yes. The morning of June 29th was rainy and overcast as I climbed. Okay, let me get back. So he says, my immediate problems are pressing ones. Would the United States air and naval forces be enough? Could the South Korean defenders supported by these forces and supplied with armor make a successful stand against the powerful war machine that was rolling down upon them from the north? Or would the United States ground troops have to be thrown into the battle after South Korea was lost? In my past wars, there was only one way for me to learn such things, and there was only one way now. I decided to go to Korea and see for myself. The morning of June 29th, there was raining and overcast. I climbed into the baton. The news from Korea seemed even more disastrous than it had the day before. The capital city of Seoul was under heavy attack, and the South Korean government had moved to temporary headquarters at Daejeon. Here I was 50 years of service behind me, over half of which had been on foreign soil, a record for American Army officers, now facing another desperate campaign. And once again it looked like a forlorn hope. Once again I was being thrust into the breach against almost insuperable odds. Once again it was Bataan and Corregidor in New Guinea. I confess that for a fleeting moment my heart failed me. But as the plane rose above the murk of the overcast, I pulled out my corncob pipe, and as its smoke curled up in I was myself again. Someone said, I haven't seen you smoke that pipe, General, for years. I don't dare smoke it back in Tokyo, I explained. They'd think I was nothing but a farmer. The Peers Club would surely blackball me.
Now, let's remember that MacArthur, he might be called the Moses of the American military history because he did his greatest campaigns after he retired as a general, and they called him back into retirement. So this wasn't a young whippersnapper. This was a man that was a warrior to the very end, a very great man. Most people give up at the age of 45, 50, retire. No, he still had the warrior in him to his end of his days. So what does he assess as the problem, and how does he turn this around?
So the Bataan lands at Suwon, 20 miles south of Seoul. Fuel clouds of oily smoke and some bombed and chafed transports that had just been attacked and destroyed. I commandeered a jeep and headed north toward the Han River, under constant air bombardment, to the dreadful backwash of the defeated and dispersed army. The South Korean forces were in complete and disorganized flight. We reached the banks of the Han just in time to be caught up in the last rearguard action to defend its bridges. Seoul was already in enemy hands. Only a mile away, I could see the towers of smoke rising from the ruins of this 14th century city. I pushed forward toward a hill a little way ahead. It was a tragic scene. Across the Han, Seoul burned and smoked in its agony of destruction. There was constant cramp of red mortar fire as the enemy swooped down toward the bridges. Below me, in the streaming by both sides of the hill, were the retreating and painting columns of disorganized troops, the drab color of their weaving lines interspersed here and there with the bright red crosses of ambulances filled with broken, groaning men. The sky was resonant with shrieking missiles of death, and everywhere the stench and utter destruction, utter dissolution of a stricken battlefield, clogging all the roads in a withering, dust-clouded mass of humanity were the refugees. But among them there was no hysteria, no whimpering. Here were a progeny of a proud and sturdy race that for centuries had accepted disaster imperturbably as they painfully plodded south, carrying all their worldly belongings on their backs, and leading their terror-stricken but wide-eyed, ungrowing children. I watched for an hour the pitiful evidence of a disaster I had inherited. In that brief interval on the bloody soaked hill, I formulated my plans. They were desperate plans indeed, but I could see no other way except to accept a defeat which would include not only Korea, but all of continental Asia.
Mhm. And as the communists advanced, they didn't merely just push forward, they started a horrible purge, killing intellectuals, clergy, businessmen, bankers. They decimated South Korea so much to this day, many Koreans remember that and don't any kind of peace, though that's changed in recent decades. But um, this is all this death and mayhem is on the fault of the American administration. I think we're still in the administration of Truman here because
Mhm.
it's in 52 that I was elected. So, you know,
So then he sends out a telegram to Washington. The South Korean forces are in confusion, organized and equipped as a light force for maintenance of interior order. They were unprepared for attack by armor and air. Conversely, they are incapable of gaining the initiative over such a force as embedded as that embodied in the North Korean army. The South Koreans had made no preparation for defense in depth for echelons of supply or for supply system. No plans had been made, or if made, were not executed for the destruction of supplies or materials in the event of a retrograde movement. As a result, they have either lost or abandoned their supplies and heavier equipment and have absolutely no system of intercommunication. In most cases, the individual soldier in his flight to the south has retained his rifle or carbine. They are gradually being gathered up by an advance group of my officers I sent over for the purpose. Without artillery, mortars, and anti-tank guns, they can only hope to retard the enemy through the fullest utilization of natural obstacles and under the guidance of leadership of high quality. The civilian populace is tranquil, orderly, and prosperous according to their scale of living. They have retained a high degree of national spirit and firm belief in the Americans. The roads leading south from Seoul are crowded with refugees refusing to accept the communist rule. It is essential that enemy advance be held, or its impetus will threaten the overrunning of all of Korea. The South Korean army is incapable of counteraction, and there is a grave danger of further breakthrough. If the enemy advances continue much further, it will threaten the Republic. The only assurance for holding the present line and ability to regain latter lost ground is through the introduction of the United States ground combat forces into the Korean battle area. To continue to utilize the forces of our air and navy without the effective ground element cannot be decisive. Unless provision is made for the full utilization of the Army Navy Air Team in this shattered area, our mission will at best be needlessly costly in life, money, and prestige. At worst, it might be doomed.
Well, that's exactly right. And uh, this is what turns the tide, because actually Washington really didn't want to do anything. And they didn't think there was any way. But MacArthur's ability to organize the military and to see a way out of it saved them from some political embarrassment in Washington. Perhaps they didn't expect it to go this bad. But you know, this is the story of American politics, and Democrats always being saved by conservatives when they want to be saved or need to it for the polls. Okay, so if I remember correctly, Ian organizes the Americans and the British to embark in South Korea and disembark in South Korea. You might even say invade, and carve out a little enclave in the southeast. Does he say anything about that in his memoirs?
So, within
This is
24
a couple
hours,
weeks later.
yeah, President Truman authorized the use of ground troops. The number of combat elements which might be withdrawn from Japan without impairing the country's safety was left to my discretion. Thus, the United States accepted communism challenge to combat in Korea. The risk that Soviet or Chinese communists might enter the war was clearly understood and defiantly accepted. The American tradition had always been that once our troops are committed to battle, the full power and means of the nation will be mobilized and dedicated to fight for victory, not for stalemate or compromise. And I set out to the chart of strategic course which would make that victory possible, not not by the wildest stretch of imagination did I dream that this tradition might be broken.
Now, is this the first war that wasn't declared by Congress?
Yes, it was.
So this starts a very bad precedent in American foreign politics, which has led to lots of abuses. Does he say anything about why Congress didn't declare a war, or why the president only wanted a military action? You know, even Russia in the Ukraine used the same kind of excuse, a military operation,
So
special operation.
he says that when we are going to go to war, it is the Congress' duty to issue the declaration of war. But it's the first time ever that it wasn't issued from the Congress, but by the executive branch, the office of the president.
I guess the Congress didn't want the political liability of having voted for another war.
So since that moment, our Congress has never issued a true declaration of war. It always comes
So
from the president.
this is very serious. This is an arrogation of the right of the war, which was given by the Constitution to the Congress alone, now to the executive branch. So this is how the deep state grabs power. This is their first power grab, the power of war we're going to see in the 60s with the CIA then grabs power from from Kennedy to declare war in Vietnam. They're actually the ones that started the war in Vietnam. It wasn't even Kennedy. So once you don't follow the constitution of your country, you're going to find that everyone starts stealing the power, and then you don't know who's running the country anymore. And isn't that the case? You know.
Yeah. So
what was his plan for the reconquest of South Korea?
yeah, he's brought over what American forces he had in Japan, and that could be deployed without causing any security issues in Japan.
Mhm.
Then the British also joined in, and then finally from the mainland of America, troops started to pour in from. So he writes, the effect of American ground troops, however small in number, resisting the enemy advance confirmed my hopes. The enemy commander at once brought his advance to a stop to permit the labors bringing up artillery from across the river without benefit of the regular bridges, which our Air Force by then had destroyed. He had no way of knowing either the strength of the American forces already committed and their immediate support or what change in the battle situation the presence presaged. He decided, as I had anticipated, against taking any chance. So instead of continuing to drive his tank columns forward, he deployed all his forces across the difficult terrain in conventional lines of battle. This was his fatal error. He had exacted a painful sacrifice from my men committed to this unequal battle, but it paid off in precious time, so essential in any tactic, and the prevailing situation was to be successful. During those first days of American fighting in South Korea, I threw in troops by air in hope of establishing a locus of resistance around which I could rally the fast retreating South Korean forces. I had hoped by that arrogant display of strength to fool the enemy into a belief that I had greater resources at my disposal than I did. We gained 10 days by this process before the enemy had deployed in line of battle along the 150-mile front, with Suwon at the pivotal point. By that time I had brought forth the rest of the 24th Division under Major General William F. Dean, with orders to delay the enemy until I could bring the 1st Cavalry Division and the 25th Division over from Japan. Dean fought a very desperate series of isolated combats in which a large part of that division was destroyed. While this had happened, the enemy commander had realized his mistake. He had been stopped not by a massive American defensive force, but merely by the appearance of force, by that arrogant display of strength. He moved rapidly to make up for the time he had lost, but it was too late. I had by this time established the Eighth Army in Korea. The enemy, though, still had its enormous superiority in manpower, in weight and quality of arms. Aided by this preponderance of numbers and weapons, he was able to simultaneously to exert heavy pressure against General Walker's men in the center and flow around them on both sides.
So he shows a very important tactic, and that is when time is of the essence, instead of retreating or advancing, your chief objective is to waste the time of your enemy and make time so that you get the time you need. And very brilliant strategy. You see, he's a 5-star, and he's fighting like a 2-star general there. And uh, that's what saved Korea. And then from this we call it enclave or bridgehead in Southeast Korea, the American line expands all the way to take back not only the territory lost, but push all the way to the Chinese border. U.S. armed and allied forces took back nearly all of Korea. There was only a few pockets left. And then came but that was achieved, however, through the invasion of Incheon.
You're getting way ahead there, buddy.
I know, because we can't do more than an hour on the program. But why do you want to quote some other important
Yeah, so he learns another thing about Washington and their cronies. On July 7th, I made my first call to Washington for reinforcement. In a message to the Joint Chiefs, I explained that we were facing an aggressive and well-trained professional army. And then he was amazed when this message was desperate need for necessary strength to implement a Washington decision was disapproved by Washington itself. The reasons given were that no increase of any part of the armed services had been authorized. Two, a suitable United States military posture in other parts of the world had to be maintained. Third, there was a shortage of shipping. With all this amounted to actually was the old faulty principle of priorities under which the Far East was again at the bottom of the list.
Yeah, having been the chief of staff of the armed forces, he probably could say a lot more than what he did about that kind of decision. Total incompetence, but this is, if you elect incompetence, you'll get incompetence in any part of the federal government. And the Inchon invasion, which was his way of taking back most of the Korean Peninsula, was the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of mankind. It was his brainchild. It was unique because he was not a Navy man. Remember, he's Army, and yet he planned the whole thing, and he brought he got the Navy to agree to it because once he showed them that, that he had air supremacy, and the men landed on a totally undefended beach and surprised by starting a new front way behind the main line. That caused the North Korean armed forces to go into rout and retreat rapidly. And then after that, their army pretty much collapsed
Yes,
because the
so
amount of armed forces pouring in through the Incheon was just more than they can handle. So
so
if
now we get to
AJ, you'll put a link.
John.
Yeah, you put a link on the thing about Incheon. What are some of the stats about Incheon? How many ships are involved? How many men are involved?
Okay, the target I selected was Incheon, 20 miles west of Seoul, and the second largest port in South Korea. The target date, because of the great tides at Incheon, had to be the middle of September. This meant that the staging for the landing at Incheon would have to be accomplished more rapidly than any other large amphibious operation in modern warfare. On July 23rd, I enabled Washington. The operation planned mid-September is amphibious landing of a two-division corps in rear of the enemy lines for purpose of enveloping and destroying enemy forces in conjunction with attack from the south by the Eighth Army. I am firmly convinced that early and strong effort behind his front will sever his main lines of communication, enable us to deliver a decisive crushing blow. The alternate is his frontal attack, which can only result in protracted and expensive campaign. My plan was opposed by powerful military influences in Washington. The essence of the operation depended on the great amphibious movement, but the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Omar Bradley, was the considered opinion that such amphibious operations were obsolete, that there would never be another successful movement of this sort. He had stirred up a storm in calling Navy personnel, which included Marines, fancy Dans. President Truman was also not in favor of using Marines as a major military unit of our armed forces. In a letter to Congressman McDonough of California said, "The Marine Corps is the Navy's police force, and as long as I am president, that is what it will remain. They have a propaganda machine that is almost equal to Stalin's." After a silence of 3 weeks, the Joint Chiefs wired me that General Joseph Collins, Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, were coming to Tokyo to discuss this maneuver with me. It was evident immediately upon their arrival that the actual purpose of the trip was not much to discuss as to dissuade. On August 23rd, I called a strategic conference to debate the problem at the Daiichi building in Tokyo. The conference included General Collins and Admiral Sherman, as well as Marine Chief Lieutenant General Lemuel C. Shepard Jr., my air commander Stratemeyer, my chief of staff Ullman, whom I had already designated commander of X Corps of the 10th Corps, which was to make Incheon landing, my navy commander Joy, my fleet commander Strubble, my amphibious expert Admiral James T. Doyle, and gathering of other staff officers and aides making up a veritable constellation of silver stars. As at Pearl Harbor Conference with Roosevelt and Nimitz in 1944, the Navy presented its case first. A naval briefing staff argued that two elements, tides and rain, made a landing at Incheon extremely hazardous. They referred to Navy hydraulic studies, which listed the average rise and fall of the tides at Incheon at 20.7 feet, one of the greatest in the world. On the tentative target date for the invasion, the rise and fall would be more than 30 feet because of the position of the moon. Wincheon's tides were at full ebb. The mud banks that had accumulated over centuries from the Yellow Sea jutted from the shore in some places as far as 2 miles out into the harbor. So they were going on, like, you can't do this. Tides are too big. There's mud banks everywhere.
Yeah, the men will get off the boats and fall in the mud and then drown. And I just want to make a comment. Omar Bradley is the general that failed at Anzio and failed at D-Day and caused thousands of men to die because they didn't want to point Patton. So Omar Bradley is saying this kind of operation is obsolete is a backhanded way of saying you're going to show that I'm an idiot if you do this because you're competent, I'm not. And that very petty, a man who will go down in history as having a really low reputation, Omar Bradley. MacArthur, who wasn't a Navy man, proved them all wrong. What did his team propose to counter these fears of the U.S. Navy?
So, this thing goes on for over and over.
He goes into a lot of detail about it, but.
And on August 29th, I received a wire from the Joint Chiefs of Staffs. We concur after reviewing the information brought back by General Collins and Admiral Sherman in making preparations and executing a turning movement by amphibious forces on the west coast of Korea at Incheon. So finally, they agree. After they met the real experts.
Yes. The backstory here is they realized how risky it was. They approved it because they figured MacArthur would make a complete mess of it, and then they could replace him. And so that was the real politics in the Department of Defense, about what was going on. But he proved them wrong. What he had the Marines do is he had the Marines come in the pitch of night on the high tide and in absolute darkness, so they couldn't even see where they were headed. And only at the very, very first dawn of any glimmer of light, be able to see the coast. They were already close enough to avoid the water going out and leaving them in mud. And they got ashore in such a short time that they surprised the North Koreans in their beds. And it was an outstanding victory. And he only sent 2 corps, but once they got control of Incheon Harbor, then they moved in lots more forces.
So, yeah.
What does he say about the conclusion of the invasion of Incheon? Did he have some celebratory note or?
Yeah, he's like, that the Marines landed on that Incheon, not Walmingdu and the other areas, and they hit the beach and invaded so fast that the guns on the beach of the North Koreans and Russians were silent. They didn't know what was happening. And by 8 a.m., an orderly climbed up to the to the bridge and hands me a slip of paper. It says that the first wave of Marines have landed and secured a beachhead without a single fatality. I turned to Admiral Doyle and said, "Please send this message to the fleet. The Navy and the Marines have never shone more brightly than this morning. Let's go down and have breakfast."
And compare this to where they lost thousands on the beach and more than 4,000 men were killed at D-Day because they had no, they're just totally muffed it up, Anfield, I think they landed easily, but they didn't push in and they got right. But in D-Day, they basically told the enemy they're coming, and they attacked one of the most fortified beaches in Europe. So this shows you that if you had to compare MacArthur to Bradley, Bradley would be like a one-star general. MacArthur would be like 7. This guy's intelligence is so much higher. And the brilliance of a strategist is not how to execute a battle, like how to execute the invasion, to know when and where to do it to surprise your enemy. Because if you can hit him where he's not defending himself, that's the best plan. And you've got to think out of the box for that. And MacArthur was that. So after that, after Inchon, MacArthur's fame in the U.S. just went to the stars. He became a national hero, and he became a threat.
Yeah, so after the Marines went in the dark and cover of darkness in secret, the 10th Corps of the Army also moved inland rapidly. So rapidly that it broke the backs of the Reds, that they couldn't use their equipment, they couldn't have communications, they couldn't get supplies. The regiments ceased to exist, the Red regiments. And within a month, a total of Red captives rose to 130,000.
This is one of the greatest American military victories ever. And you don't hear about Inchon. I remember growing up, I didn't learn about Inchon, I think, until I was in college, because no one talks about it. Maybe there was a movie made of it, but they never show it, and they'll never show it, because MacArthur's not one of their men. They always show D-Day, a day of victory. D-Day was a failed invasion. They were stuck on the beaches for 6 weeks, and they didn't get out until they brought Patton on board. And they gave Patton the charge to go to Paris, and he just cut through the lines. They couldn't get through a single bog in France. These Bradley and his crew of idiots, Eisenhower and all of them. So it shows you how good MacArthur
So on the
was.
28th of September, the entire city of Seoul had been cleared from enemy forces. And on the 29th, the government that was at the very tip of the last remaining piece of land of South Korea, the government was restored back to Seoul on the 29th.
Talk about a 5-day maneuver. This was the largest amphibious invasion, involved more ships and more men and more equipment than D-Day. Most people, D-Day is exaggerated, but Inchon was much, much bigger, much more difficult. Land in mud is much more difficult. And it shows you the level of organization. He was a great organizer. And so
at the Capitol building,
it took the communists.
It took them by surprise, and once everything was pretty much back to normal in Seoul, at the Capitol building, I pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on General Walker and General Allman, citing them for their marked skill and courage in exploiting the decisive pincer movement of Incheon. The scene was impressive as the ceremony of handing back the capital city began. In the war-shattered assembly room sat row on row of heavily armored officers and men of both UN and ROK armies. On both sides of the room, the windows gaped brokenly, and the smell of death drifted through them. My thoughts went back to the day at Malakon Palace in Manila. when I handed the seat of government over to the authorities of the Philippines. I ask that all present rise and join me in reciting the Lord's Prayer. The steel helmets and mud-caked fatigue caps came off as everyone rose to their feet. Together, we recited the Lord's Prayer. I remember the particles of glass tinkling down from the shattered roof of the assembly room as I concluded. Then thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Then I turned to Sigmund Rhee and said virtually the same words that I had spoken 5 years before to Sergio Osmina. Mr. President, my officers and I will now resume our military duties and leave you and your government to the discharge of the civil responsibilities. President Reed seemed deeply moved by it all. He rose and clasped my hand. We admire you, he said, with tears flowing down his cheeks. We love you as a savior of our race. And when the ceremony was over, the people of Seoul lined the streets and clapped and waved their little paper flags. I returned to Tokyo.
And he drives on the men to the next half of the war was really tough, but he got all the way up to the Chinese border, and he could have pushed his way to be king. And then came the ridiculous thing. No, 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 no. He says, I have to bomb these bridges because they're sending over reinforcements.
Yeah.
And what's his famous line there? Because he was told.
So he pushes to the Chinese border, and there is one bridge. And Washington sends a directive back, and it says, you may bomb your half of the bridge. He's like, how do you bomb half a bridge?
Yes. And at his threat to punish MacArthur and to get him out of the way, they used the Marxist left-leaning press, exaggerated what he said to encourage the Chinese to throw in 1 million men. And the Chinese pushed the border all the way back to the 37th parallel where it is today. So there was a lot of politics in that war and a lot of underhanded dealing, but in the light of it all, MacArthur shown through he was a great warrior, a great soldier. You could say he's a great crusader. You see, what he did in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was a God-fearing Christian, and that's why God blessed him. And this is why he was hated. And in our next program, we're going to cover the rest of his life after Korea. What does he do?
Yes.
And what is the strange death?
So when he is forced out of, fired, the men who fired him are the same ones who declared war on the Catholic Church around the same time period. Those men were Dean Rusk, Nelson Rockefeller, John Foster Dulles, and Avery Harriman.
Skull and Bones men.
The same men who, as the head honchos of the World Council of Churches, paid the Vatican $1 million, or a little more, in today's currency, to call for a second ecumenical council.
Mm-hmm. So this is one reason why we're covering MacArthur's life, because it's tied in this whole history of how the rise of the deep state, the war against Christ and his church on earth, and the actions of the Skull and Bones' deeper and deeper penetration and control of the U.S. government and the U.S. military. Yeah. So thank you, AJ, for having me on this. Short, we did a very short summary of the Korean War, and there's a lot of information in the Korean War. If you know anything about it, do study it. There's a lot of lessons we learned there. If you can put a link for the invasion of Incheon there for people who don't know about it and would like to learn something about it. And thank you for having me on Auto Militaris Radio TV.
Yeah. So our next program next week will be where he gives speeches to the Congress and his amazing speech at West Point. Then we'll drop the book, and we'll do our own thing on to cover how he was how he died. So please stay tuned for that one next week. And this is Or Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
There's